Shadows before the devil. Long before the medieval imagination painted the devil with horns, claws, and fire in his breath, human beings had already populated their nights with spirits that frightened and fascinated. In the dimly lit forests of pre-Christian Europe, in the deserts of the Near East, and along the river valleys of Mesopotamia, people explained misfortune by naming it, embodying it, and giving it form. The Middle Ages would inherit this enormous treasury of shadows, reshaping them into something far more organized and sinister. To understand the devil of medieval Christendom, we must first walk through the twilight world that existed before him, the realm of restless demons, mischievous tricksters, and pagan gods pushed to the margins. Picture an Iron Age village in northern Europe. The harvest has failed, and the air feels damp with suspicion. Was it angry ancestors withholding their blessing, or unseen spirits that spoiled the grain? In Norse lands, people spoke of Draugr, revenants who rose from their graves to torment the living. Among the Celts, whispers told of shape-shifting beings, sometimes helpful, sometimes cruel, that inhabited the boundaries of forest and river. In every culture, supernatural blame explained natural calamity, lightning, plague, stillbirth, famine. These were not accidents but intrusions, signs of a world teeming with hostile intelligences. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks named their daimonia, spirits not yet demonic in the Christian sense, but mediators between gods and humans. A daimon might inspire poetry or lead one astray into madness. The Romans inherited them as genius and la, household guardians who could be generous or petulant. It was only after Christianity absorbed this world of spirits that the semantic shift occurred. Demon became demon, something wholly malignant. Scholars still debate whether Christianity intentionally demonized pagan gods to stamp out rival faiths, or whether the transformation was slower, a linguistic drift hardened by centuries of polemic. But even earlier than Greece and Rome, Mesopotamia had already conjured beings chillingly close to the devils of later Europe. The Assyrians feared Pazuzu, a lion-headed wind demon blamed for disease, especially in children. The Sumerians described Lamashtu, a female demoness who preyed on mothers during childbirth. Protective amulets, incantations, and rituals tried to keep them at bay, but the logic was clear. Malevolent forces stalked human life, and only ritual knowledge could push them back. When Christianity arrived centuries later, many of these patterns of thought slid neatly into new molds. In Jewish tradition, particularly in the apocryphal writings circulating between the Old and New Testaments, we see figures that would become cornerstones of medieval demonology. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, angels who fell to earth, taught forbidden knowledge, and fathered monstrous offspring. These stories, though not canon for most Christians, coloured imaginations for centuries. They suggested that evil was not merely earthly, but cosmic, that rebellion against God had already cracked the heavens long before humanity struggled in the dust. Now imagine a scriptorium in the 8th century, where a monk bent over his manuscript scratches carefully onto parchment, and Satan was cast down. For him, Satan is no vague cultural memory, but a living enemy. Yet, the ink on his page still carries the weight of earlier centuries, when every rustle in the night might be a fairy, every fever a demon. What the medieval church would later call the devil was, in truth, an amalgam of these countless phantoms inherited from older worlds. And it is here that a curious tidbit arises. In early medieval Germany, records describe villagers leaving food offerings at crossroads to placate spirits, sometimes interpreted as devils, sometimes as the old pagan gods. To the church, such rituals were heresy. To the peasant, they were survival. Crossroads, after all, were liminal spaces, and liminal spaces were where the devil loved to walk. The early Middle Ages did not yet have the devil as the terrifying red figure we picture today. Instead, He was a murky presence, often interchangeable with local bogies or older gods. A Christian preacher in Anglo-Saxon England might condemn worship of Woden, declaring him a demon in disguise. A village elder, meanwhile, might simply call Woden the Old One, dangerous but still powerful. The boundary between God, spirit, and devil was not sharp but blurred, a shifting landscape of belief. This gradual transformation from a world crowded with many spirits to a universe ruled by one great adversary was not accidental. It reflected the broader shift toward monotheism's stark moral dualities. Christianity demanded one supreme God and therefore one supreme enemy. What had been a tangle of spirits and gods became increasingly organized under the dark banner of Satan. Scholars still debate whether this unification of evil simplified the world for believers or made it more terrifying. For now, all calamities could be traced back to a single cosmic foe. So, when we later arrive at the Middle Ages proper, with its horned demons leaping from cathedral walls and its witch trials fueled by visions of Satan, we must remember these shadows before the devil. The medieval imagination did not invent him from nothing. It inherited the fears of countless generations, from Sumer to the Saxons, and distilled them into a figure both familiar and utterly new. The devil was a patchwork, stitched together from humanity's most enduring nightmares. As the Church's authority spread across Europe, it did not erase these ancient fears, but baptized them. Old spirits became demons, old gods became devils, and old rituals were rebranded as sorcery. And so, by the dawn of the High Middle Ages, the devil was waiting, not yet with the polished horns of Renaissance paintings, but with the primal weight of thousands of years of terror behind him. Lucifer becomes Satan. The story of the devil in the Middle Ages cannot move forward without pausing to ask how this adversary acquired his name, his features, and his role as the cosmic enemy of humankind. For in the earliest Christian centuries, the devil was not yet the horned figure of popular imagination, but a slippery, shifting adversary who wore many titles: Satan, Lucifer, the Tempter, the Ancient Serpent. To medieval believers, however, he was more than a name. He was the villain at the centre of the great drama of salvation. In Hebrew scripture, Satan first appears not as a proper name, but as a role, the accuser, the adversary, the one who opposes. In the book of Job, Satan is a member of the heavenly court, testing Job's faith with God's permission. This was not yet the devil of later centuries, but a prosecutor, an officer of divine justice. Only later would this figure break free of the courtroom and become the embodiment of rebellion itself. The title Lucifer, meaning light-bearer or morning star, came from a different source. Isaiah 14, a passage mocking the king of Babylon, who aspired too high and was cast down. Early Christian interpreters, especially by the 4th century, began to see in this fall from heaven an allegory of a proud angel cast into hell. Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation of morning star into Lucifer gave the fallen angel a name. Thus Lucifer and Satan merged, fusing Old Testament adversary with fallen angelic rebel. By the Middle Ages, this fusion was taken for granted. Monks and bishops told the story with vivid certainty. Lucifer, once the brightest of God's angels, grew proud, declared, "I will not serve," and was cast into the abyss with his rebellious hosts. This cosmic drama explained the presence of evil in the world and gave Christians a clear villain in their spiritual battles. Scholars still debate whether this merging of texts was a deliberate theological move or an accidental overlap born of translation and imagination. Theologians such as Augustine of Hippo helped crystallize this image. In the city of God, Augustine argued that pride was the root of Lucifer's fall, just as it was the root of humanity's rebellion in Eden. Satan tempted Adam and Eve not merely out of malice, but because misery loves company. The devil desired to drag humanity down into his own ruin. Augustine's interpretation spread widely through sermons and scriptoria, ensuring that medieval Europe saw Lucifer's fall as both a cosmic tragedy and a personal threat. But the devil was not confined to scripture and sermons. He began to take shape in art and imagination. In early medieval carvings, Satan often appeared as a dragon or serpent, echoing the ancient serpent of Revelation. In others, he bore wings, a grotesque inversion of angelic form. Over time, artists added horns, tails, and cloven hooves, features borrowed from pagan gods like Pan and fauns. Here we see a curious irony. The very imagery of Europe's old deities was used to flesh out the Christian devil. To fear Satan was, in a way, to still fear the old gods lingering at the edge of memory. Consider the writings of Gregory the Great in the 6th century. For Gregory, the devil was not only a tempter, but a strategist, a general marshalling his legions of demons to attack humanity's weak points. He was no longer a shadowy accuser in God's court. He had become the commander of hell, orchestrating a vast and ongoing war. This militarization of the devil's role gave medieval Christians a sense that their daily struggles, lust, greed, despair, were not simply personal failings, but battles in a cosmic war. Quirky traces of this evolving identity appear in unexpected places. In medieval bestiaries, for example, descriptions of real animals were often laced with moral lessons. The crocodile, which lured prey with fake tears, was compared to the devil, who tempts with false promises. The weasel, thought to conceive through the ear, symbolized the Virgin Mary's pure conception, while other creatures, like the viper, embodied diabolical deceit. In these texts, Satan slipped seamlessly into the natural order, his tricks mirrored in the animal kingdom. By the 11th century, the devil had become indispensable in preaching. Parish priests warned that Satan prowled about like a roaring lion, echoing the first epistle of Peter. He was not abstract but visceral, crouching at the edge of the village, whispering at the ear of every sinner. This immediacy fueled penitential culture. Confession, fasting, and prayer were not just rituals but weapons in the fight against the devil's snares. Scholars still debate whether this intense focus on Satan empowered believers, making them vigilant warriors of faith, or oppressed them with constant fear of failure. We must also remember how the devil was used politically. A ruler might brand his enemies as satanic, framing rebellion not as a political struggle, but as cosmic treason. In chronicles of the First Crusade, Muslims were sometimes described as agents of the devil, a rhetoric that dehumanized opponents while galvanizing soldiers. In this way, Lucifer's fall from heaven became entangled with earthly power, his shadow stretching across both battlefield and church pulpit. In monasteries, where men and women lived cloistered lives of prayer, the devil was a daily companion. The 12th century monk, Peter the Venerable, described Satan as the ape of God, imitating divine works but always corrupting them. To monks, this explained why heresies read why temptation crept even into sacred spaces. A devil in disguise might look like an angel of light, reminding the faithful that vigilance was eternal. By the time we stand firmly in the Middle Ages, then, the devil is no longer just an adversary of Scripture. He is Lucifer, the fallen star, Satan, the roaring lion, the dragon, the tempter, the ape of God. He has absorbed ancient spirits, pagan gods, and biblical fragments into one towering figure. And though theologians could debate his exact origins or powers, ordinary Christians knew one thing with certainty. Their lives unfolded on a battlefield, and the devil was the enemy. Monks, manuscripts, monsters. The Middle Ages was, above all else, an age of the written word, yet written not for the masses, but for the few who could read, and fewer still who could produce. Inside the cold stone walls of monasteries, in scriptoria, where only the faint light of candles broke the gloom, monks bent over parchment, shaping letters with quills dipped in oak gall ink. They did not only transcribe the Gospels or preserve Aristotle, they also populated the margins with devils, squatting, leering, and grimacing. The devil was not only preached from pulpits, he stared back from the very pages that preserved Christian learning. Picture a 12th century manuscript, the sacred text at the centre, but at the edges, where the reader's eye might drift, bizarre creatures cavort. A demon with a bird's head and goat's legs tugs at a monk's robe. A grotesque face with its tongue lolling mocks the holy words above it. These marginalia, part artistic flourish and part moral warning, reveal that the devil was always at the edge of thought, literally written into the margins of faith. Scholars still debate whether these images were meant as light-hearted parody, serious instruction, or both. Illuminated manuscripts such as the Bible Moralise, created in 13th century France, show Satan as the great deceiver, tempting Eve with a serpent's body but a woman's face. The blending of human and animal was a common way to represent evil. To the medieval mind, deformity or hybrid form signified corruption, a twisting of God's creation. Thus demons often appeared as grotesque combinations, bird claws with lion torsos, or faces sprouting from knees. They were impossible beings, because evil itself was impossible in God's perfect order, an intrusion, a mockery. Some of the most chilling depictions appear in psalters, books of psalms for personal devotion. In the Luttrell Psalter of the 14th century, among its famous illustrations of rural life, devils lurk, strange hybrid creatures tormenting souls, taunting monks, or grinning from the borders. The juxtaposition is startling. Images of farmers ploughing the fields sit beside demons, tugging at sinners. It was a visual reminder that the devil was never far away, no matter how ordinary the day might seem. One quirky tidbit survives in a 9th century manuscript now in St. Gallen. A devil is drawn not in monstrous form, but like a mischievous jester holding a mirror. Mirrors themselves were ambiguous objects in medieval thought, tools of vanity, but also of reflection and truth. A devil holding a mirror seemed to suggest that temptation was not out there, but in here, staring back at the self. Beyond the pages, monks wrestled with the devil in their own minds. The writings of the Desert Fathers, those early Christian hermits in Egypt, circulated widely in medieval monasteries. Stories told of Anthony the Great, who was beaten by demons in his cave, or of monks who saw visions of beautiful women sent by Satan to test their chastity. When a monk copied these stories, he was not merely preserving them, but reliving them, believing that the devil prowled within cloisters just as much as in the world outside. The devil also appeared in didactic texts, often in dialogue form. In the dialogues of Gregory the Great, demons tempt monks with sloth, acedia, the noonday demon, that strange mixture of fatigue, restlessness, and despair. To medieval monastics, Satan was not always the roaring lion of Scripture, but the whisperer of boredom, urging a monk to nap rather than pray. This subtlety shaped the way devils were drawn, sometimes fierce, sometimes comical, but always intrusive, never absent. And yet these grotesque marginalia also carried humour. Monks doodled demons farting, fighting, or gnawing on oversized spoons. To modern eyes, they look like satire. To medieval readers, they may have been both joke and warning. Evil was ridiculous as well as dangerous, pathetic as well as terrifying. To laugh at a devil was, perhaps, to rob him of his sting. Still, the seriousness of the devil's role remained ever present. Cathedrals themselves became giant manuscripts of stone, their sculptures echoing the same imagery. Gargoyles, leering faces, and monstrous figures clung to the sides of sacred buildings, reminding worshippers that hell lurked just beyond the threshold of heaven. Just as the devil grinned from the corner of a psalter, he sneered from the eaves of Notre Dame. One famous image that captivated medieval imagination was the Hellmouth, a gaping monster's mouth into wide. Sinners were herded at Judgment Day. Found in manuscripts like the Winchester Psalter, Celso 1150, it showed the devil and his minions shoving naked souls into fiery jaws. The mouth, at once animal and cosmic, was a visual shorthand for hell itself. Such images blurred the boundary between manuscript and stage, for the Hellmouth would later become a central prop in medieval theatre. Scholars still debate whether these monstrous depictions reflected what ordinary people actually believed, or whether they were largely the invention of clerical artists and writers. Was the devil in the margins a shared reality for villagers in the fields, or was he primarily a monastic obsession, magnified in the cloister? Whatever the answer, the result was the same. Satan's presence seeped into both imagination and art, shaping the visual language of evil for centuries. Thus, as we turn the page from the early medieval centuries into the later Middle Ages, the devil has already found a permanent place in the Western mind, not just in theology, but in ink, parchment, and stone. He crouched in the margins, laughed in the gargoyles, and whispered through illuminated figures. To read a book or enter a cathedral was to encounter not only the divine, but its shadow, and this shadow would only grow darker as medieval life unfolded. The devil's playground. If the scriptorium and the cathedral represented the solemn face of medieval Christianity, the village square and the carnival represented its unruly underside. For while the devil lurked in manuscripts and homilies, he also came alive in laughter, masks, and the wild reversals of medieval festivals. Here, at least for a few days a year, ordinary people danced with devils, mocked sacred order, and let chaos rule. The devil was not only a figure of fear, he was also an entertainer, a clown, and sometimes a guest of honour. Imagine a frosty morning in 14th century France. The Feast of Fools is underway. Clergy themselves don grotesque costumes, bray like donkeys during Mass, and parade through town on carts while peasants jeer and cheer. At the heart of the festival is inversion. Priests act like laypeople, peasants like kings, children like bishops. Authority turns upside down, and with it the devil sneaks in. For if order was sacred, disorder belonged to him. The line between parody and blasphemy was thin, and church councils frequently condemned such spectacles as diabolical, yet they persisted, irresistible in their energy. The Feast of Fools was only one among many. Carnival, celebrated before Lent, was a riot of masks, dancing, and bawdy humour. Masks themselves had a dangerous aura. To wear one was to play with identity, to step into another self. Some masks bore horns or monstrous faces, transforming their wearers into devils for a night. Bonfires blazed, wine flowed, and sexual innuendo mixed with religious parody. The devil became both scapegoat and mascot, blamed for excess, yet gleefully invited to the party. Scholars still debate whether these festivals were tolerated as harmless safety valves or feared as genuine gateways to sin. One curious tidbit survives in records from medieval Germany. During certain carnival plays, a character, dressed as the devil, would chase children through the streets, threatening to drag them to hell if they disobeyed their parents. This was both theatre and discipline, a mixture of laughter and warning. To run from the devil was fun. To disobey him was unthinkable. The game instilled fear in the young, but wrapped it in play. Beyond festivals, devils also strutted on stage in religious dramas, mystery plays, performed outside churches, dramatized biblical stories, and the devil became one of the most popular roles. He was loud, comedic, and often bumbling. Audiences loved when demons bickered with each other, tripped over props, or got fooled by Christ. Yet even in comedy, the devil remained serious. His task in these plays was to drag souls toward damnation, and the laughter of the crowd masked a deep unease. To laugh at the devil was to acknowledge him, and acknowledgement was half the battle. Meanwhile, in the countryside, seasonal rituals kept alive older, half-pagan traditions that churchmen were quick to label devilish. Bonfire festivals at midsummer or midwinter often involved leaping flames, dancing in circles, or wearing animal masks. Such rituals, meant to ensure fertility and ward off misfortune, blurred into Christian festivals on the calendar. Priests warned against devil dances and heathen games, but they survived well into the late Middle Ages. Scholars still debate whether these were conscious survivals of paganism or simply rural folk customs retroactively demonized by clergy. What strikes us is how omnipresent the devil was in the rhythm of medieval life. He was not confined to sermons or scholarly disputes. He appeared in the marketplace, the puppet show, the procession. He was a source of fear, but also of catharsis. To watch the devil dragged on stage, humiliated by Christ, or mocked in a carnival was to experience a moment of release. Evil might be terrifying, but in ritual time it could be contained, even laughed at. Yet these same festivals also provoked anxiety. Church records tell of bishops excommunicating performers who dared to celebrate the Feast of Fools inside sanctuaries. Priests warned that laughter opened the soul to temptation, that mockery of sacred rites invited demons into the community. One synod in Paris thundered against clergy who turned holy offices into devil's jests, and yet, ironically, the more they condemned, the more stories spread, ensuring that the devil remained a central actor in both sacred and profane imagination. We might see this tension most clearly in the medieval obsession with inversion. Hell was itself an inversion of heaven. Heat instead of light, torment instead of joy, despair instead of bliss. Festivals that reversed roles, peasants as kings, priests as fools, played with this same logic. The devil was never far from inversion because he was, in Christian thought, the inverted angel, the fallen star. To wear horns in jest was, in a sense, to walk briefly in his shoes. By the late Middle Ages, civic authorities began to regulate these festivals more tightly, aware that drunken crowds could spill into rebellion. The devil in carnival became a political figure as well as a comic one, a reminder that chaos always threatened order. But the image endured. Devils with masks, horns, and rattling chains leaping through processions, both frightening and funny. Thus, while manuscripts painted the devil in margins and monasteries prayed against his whispers, the people of the towns and villages danced with him in the square. He was feared, yes, but he was also a companion in laughter, a scapegoat for excess, and a performer in the grand theatre of medieval life. And perhaps this paradox, the devil as both terror and jest, was precisely what gave him such enduring power in the imagination. Temptations of the desert. If carnivals and feast days gave the devil his stage among the crowds, the silence of the desert gave him his stage in the human soul. For monks, hermits, and visionaries, the devil was not a mask or a comic figure, but a relentless whisperer, invading dreams and thoughts, probing every weakness. The great battle between God and Satan was often imagined as taking place not in cities or kingdoms, but within the narrow cell of a monk or the lonely cave of a hermit. Here, stripped of distraction, the devil's voice could be heard most clearly. The roots of this vision stretch back to the desert fathers of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Athanasius's Life of St. Anthony became a medieval bestseller, copied and translated across Christendom. It told how Anthony withdrew into the desert only to be pursued by demons who appeared as beasts, women, or armies. They beat him physically, tempted him sexually, and mocked him with despair. Yet Anthony resisted, turning every torment into proof of his faith. Medieval monks read such accounts not as distant legend, but as instruction. To enter a cloister was to enter a battlefield, with the devil as one's lifelong opponent. In art, the temptation of Saint Anthony became one of the most enduring scenes. From early frescoes in Byzantine monasteries to later, more surreal visions like those of Hieronymus Bosch, the devil's assaults on Anthony were shown as vivid and grotesque. Winged beasts, hybrid monsters, and swarming demons crowded around the saint, who usually knelt calmly in prayer. The message was unmistakable. Satan might roar, but Christ's servant stood firm. Yet one can imagine how terrifying such images were to monks meditating by candlelight, seeing their own private fears mirrored in paint and parchment. The medieval church also linked Satan's temptations with Christ's own desert struggle. The Gospels tell of Jesus fasting 40 days, confronted by the tempter who urged him to turn stones into bread, to leap from the temple to worship for worldly power. To monks, this was both cosmic history and daily experience. Fasting sharpened the sense of temptation, and solitude magnified the whispers of the mind. Every skipped meal became a chance for the devil to suggest indulgence, every long vigil a chance for him to whisper despair. Scholars still debate whether medieval accounts of temptation should be read as psychological struggles or as sincere belief in physical demons. Perhaps for the monks themselves, the distinction did not matter. Quirky anecdotes abound in monastic records. In one tale from the 11th century, a hermit is said to have fought off the devil, disguised as a talking raven, who tried to lure him from his cave. In another, the devil appeared as a monk's lost family member, urging him to abandon the cloister. The danger lay not only in obvious sins, but in subtle lures, nostalgia, pride, or even excessive zeal. As Gregory the Great observed, Satan could tempt with holiness itself, urging a monk to fast so severely that his health broke, or to pray so publicly that pride swelled in his heart. One of the most feared temptations was acedia, the noonday demon. Monks described it as a heavy lassitude, a desire to abandon prayer, to wander, to give up. In manuscripts, this demon was sometimes personified, a shadowy figure, pressing down on a weary monk. The devil did not need horns or flames, he only needed boredom, fatigue, or loneliness. In this, the medieval insight feels strikingly modern. Depression, restlessness, distraction, these too were seen as the devil's snares. Visionary women also recorded battles with the devil in solitude. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, saw visions of fiery dragons and blackened figures gnashing their teeth, symbols of Satan's realm. She interpreted these visions not as private nightmares, but as cosmic revelations meant for the church. Marjorie Kempe, in the 15th century, described the devil tormenting her with blasphemous thoughts and temptations, even as she wept and prayed. To read their writings is to hear the devil's voice intruding into the most intimate corners of the medieval mind. But why the desert, the wilderness, the lonely cell? Because in medieval thought the devil thrived in the absence of noise, in the absence of people, in the absence of distraction. Silence stripped away defences, leaving the soul naked to its thoughts. Yet paradoxically, that was also why the desert was sacred. To face Satan in solitude was to reenact Christ's own trial. The hermit was a soldier, and his battleground was his mind. One curious practice illustrates this vividly. Some monks kept skulls in their cells, gazing upon them daily to remember death. Such memento mori were not merely reminders of mortality, but shields against temptation. To look upon a skull was to laugh in the devil's face, saying, "You may tempt me, but death will come, and after death, judgment." The devil's whispers of pleasure or despair had lied Huon. Total power when the monk fixed his eyes on eternity. The medieval imagination thus placed the devil not only in public festivals, but in private struggle. He was as present in a carnival mask as in a hermit's sigh, as loud in the laughter of fools, as in the silence of prayer. And in the deserts of Egypt, the forests of Gaul, and the cloisters of England, countless men and women believed they fought him daily, armed with fasting, scripture, and the cross. The devil's temptations were not always spectacular. Sometimes they were ordinary, a longing for bread, a desire for sleep, a flicker of pride. But in the Middle Ages, every such flicker could be cosmic. To yield was to side with the fallen angel. To resist was to side with Christ. The battlefield of the soul stretched from sunrise to midnight, from monastery to village, and for many the devil's whispers never ceased. The devil in the courtroom. By the time Europe reached the central Middle Ages, the devil was no longer confined to the imagination of hermits or the inked margins of monks' manuscripts. He had entered the very structures of law and justice. To accuse someone of crime, heresy, or sorcery was often to accuse them of consorting with Satan himself. And in courts across Europe, whether secular or ecclesiastical, the devil became an unseen but decisive participant. His presence felt in trials, ordeals, and accusations that could cost lives. Picture a 12th century village in Germany. A theft has unsettled the community. Suspicion falls on a neighbour, but no one can prove it. Instead of weighing evidence as we might today, the case is handed over to God, or perhaps to the devil. The accused is forced to undergo an ordeal, plunging a hand into boiling water, carrying hot iron, or being thrown into a river bound hand and foot. If the wounds healed clean, innocence was proven. If not, the devil had marked the guilty. It was faith in divine justice, but beneath it lurked another conviction. Satan could interfere, trick, and cloud the truth. Trials became battlegrounds of invisible powers. The devil appeared even more dramatically in cases of possession. From the 13th century onward, stories of men and women seized by demons multiplied. Symptoms ranged from uncontrollable fits and shrieks to speaking unknown languages or revealing secrets. Judges and inquisitors often treated these cases as legal evidence. If the devil spoke through someone, it was both proof of his reality and condemnation of the victim. Scholars still debate whether these possessions reflected genuine psychological disorders, deliberate performance, or sincere spiritual experience. Whatever their cause, the courtroom turned private suffering into public theatre. One quirky tidbit comes from a 15th century French record. A pig was put on trial for killing a child. Dressed in human clothes, the pig was paraded into court, found guilty, and hanged. Why? Because the act of murder was seen as diabolical, and even animals could be pawns of the devil. Such trials of beasts, dogs, goats, even insects, occurred across Europe, blurring the line between crime and cosmic corruption. In these moments, the devil was not only a metaphor, he was a legal reality. Ordeals themselves were often framed as confrontations with Satan. The Church argued that God's power ensured truth would prevail, but priests also warned that the devil might try to cloud judgment, to heal wounds falsely, or to disguise guilt. The accused, therefore, was urged to confess, for the devil's tricks were manifold. To fail the ordeal was to prove that one had already fallen under his sway. The courtroom became not a neutral ground, but a stage where God and the devil wrestled for souls. Inquisitorial manuals of the late Middle Ages gave this theology sharper edges. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, outlined how witches supposedly made pacts with the devil, sealed by physical marks, sexual congress, or magical powers. Courts were instructed to search the accused's body for devil's marks, unexplained blemishes, or insensible patches of skin. Torture, too, was justified as a way to force the devil's servants to reveal themselves. Under these conditions, Satan's presence was not symbolic. It was assumed, and the accused bore the burden of disproving it. This legal entanglement of the devil extended even into contracts. Rumours abounded of individuals signing their names in blood, selling their souls for wealth or knowledge. courts treated such tales with deadly seriousness. Even if no written contract existed, verbal testimony or confession sufficed. The devil's pacts were imagined as exact legal agreements, binding in ways human law could recognize. A theology of evil thus blended seamlessly into jurisprudence. The paradox was stark. Christianity preached that the devil was a defeated foe, chained by Christ's resurrection. Yet in the courtroom, he seemed more powerful than ever, able to bind souls, bend wills, and sway communities. Ordinary people lived in this tension. A poor widow might be accused of witchcraft, and though she pleaded innocence, the suspicion that Satan walked with her was nearly impossible to dispel. Her trial was less about evidence than about managing collective fear. Scholars still debate how much of this was truly belief and how much was political control. Were trials of witches and heretics primarily driven by genuine fear of the devil, or were they convenient tools for consolidating authority, silencing dissent, or punishing the marginalized? The truth, as always, lies between. Belief in Satan was real and pervasive, but it was also wielded, shaped, and sharpened by those in power. Even within the church, doubts simmered. Some theologians argued that witchcraft was an illusion, that only God had true power. Others insisted the devil could indeed manipulate nature and bend the laws of the world. The courtroom mirrored this debate. Every accusation, every ordeal, every tortured confession was part of a larger question: just how much power does the devil really have? By the late Middle Ages, the devil was firmly entrenched in European legal imagination. To step into a courtroom was not simply to face human judgment, but to risk being branded an ally of hell. And for those who stood accused, the shadow of Satan was heavier than any earthly sentence: witches and the devil's pact. If the medieval courtroom made the devil a legal adversary, the witch hunts of the later Middle Ages transformed him into an intimate one. For in these years, fear shifted from vague demonic temptation to the chilling idea that ordinary people, neighbours, midwives, beggars, might willingly join Satan in his rebellion. The devil was no longer only a cosmic enemy or a carnival jester. He was imagined as the master of a secret army, recruiting souls in barns, kitchens, and lonely forests. And central to this vision was the idea of the pact, a binding agreement between human and demon, written in blood, sealed by body and soul. Early medieval law codes rarely spoke of witches in this sense. The Church long taught that magical practices were illusions, tricks of the devil that had no real power. Augustine himself argued that sorcery was nothing more than deception, that demons might trick human senses but could not alter creation. For centuries, this view tempered witchcraft accusations. Sorcerers were misguided, perhaps dangerous, but not cosmic traitors. But by the 13th and 14th centuries the climate changed. As the Inquisition sought to root out heresy, suspicion turned toward magic, divination, and healing practices. What had once been dismissed as superstition was reimagined as diabolic. A village healer who whispered charms over a wound might not merely be invoking old folk wisdom, she might be invoking Satan himself. The devil, it was said, offered knowledge, pleasure, or power in exchange for eternal allegiance. This was not a vague alliance, but a pact, imagined with chilling specificity. Manuals like the Formicarius, 1430s, and later the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, described how witches allegedly signed contracts in their own blood, renouncing baptism and offering body and soul to the devil. Some accounts insisted the devil marked her as followers with a physical blemish, an insensible spot where a pin drew no pain. Witch hunters eagerly searched for such marks, turning the human body into evidence of cosmic betrayal. Quirky details filled these stories. Some said witches kissed the devil's backside in grotesque parodies of Christian ritual. Others claimed they were given familiars, animals like cats, toads, or crows that served as demonic messengers. Still others insisted witches could fly, an ability granted not by broomsticks in the earliest tales, but by ointments supposedly made of foul ingredients. Scholars still debate whether these lurid details came from genuine folk belief, the fevered imagination of inquisitors, or the confessions of accused women under torture. What is certain is that women bore the brunt of this fear. The Malleus Maleficarum argued explicitly that women were more prone to the devil's seductions, citing Eve's role in the fall and the weaker constitution of female bodies and minds. Midwives, widows, and healers, those who lived on society's margins, were especially vulnerable. Their knowledge of herbs or birth rituals, once valued, was reinterpreted as proof of demonic alliances. Here we see the collision of gender, medicine, and theology. The Devil's Pact became a way to criminalize female autonomy. The social function of these accusations was powerful. In times of famine, plague, or misfortune, a scapegoat was needed. If a cow sickened or a child died unexpectedly, whispers of witchcraft spread. To accuse a neighbour was to name the devil's hand in the disaster, and to purge the witch was to cleanse the community. The witch thus became a vessel for collective fear, her supposed pact with Satan the explanation for otherwise inexplicable suffering. Yet not all agreed. Some scholars and clerics warned against hysteria. Johannes Nieder, author of the Formicarius, accepted the reality of witches, but noted that their powers were often exaggerated. Others within the church hesitated to credit the devil with so much autonomy, fearing that doing so diminished God's sovereignty. Still, the tide of imagination proved unstoppable. By the late 15th century, the idea of organized diabolic witchcraft had taken root, spreading from alpine valleys to the courts of France, Germany, and beyond. The psychological power of the Devil's Pact was immense. To imagine one's neighbour secretly meeting the devil at night, swearing loyalty in candlelit rituals, was to imagine evil as close, intimate, and contagious. And for the accused themselves, the pressure was unbearable. Under torture, many confessed to impossible acts, flying through the air, dining with demons, copulating with Satan. These confessions, preserved in court records, blur the line between fantasy and coercion. Did the victims come to believe their own guilt, or did they simply repeat what inquisitors demanded? Scholars still debate the degree to which witchcraft confessions reflected lived folklore or judicial invention. One haunting anecdote survives from 15th century France. A woman confessed to receiving a coin from the devil, only to find the next morning that it had turned into a withered leaf. The story circulated wide. Lie, a symbol of Satan's treachery, promising wealth but delivering decay. Such tales reinforced the belief that the devil's gifts were always poisoned, his contracts binding but never fair. Thus, the witch and the pact became central to the medieval devil's legacy. No longer was he just a roaring lion or a carnival clown. He was now imagined as a dark lord of contracts, a legalist who bound souls with ink and blood. And in this vision, the devil stepped ever closer to daily life, transforming from a distant adversary into the intimate enemy within the village, the household, even the family, the Black Mass. If the Devil's Pact transformed Satan into a personal master, the idea of the Black Mass made him the object of collective worship. By the later Middle Ages, whispers spread of secret ceremonies held at night, where witches and heretics supposedly gathered to honour the devil in rituals that mocked and inverted the Christian Mass. These tales were lurid, sensational, and deeply unsettling, for they suggested that not only individuals but entire groups might be conspiring against God under the devil's banner. The origins of the Black Mass lie in the medieval obsession with inversion. Just as carnival turned kings into fools and priests into jesters, the Black Mass was imagined as a deliberate parody of the most sacred Christian rite. The Eucharist. In place of consecrated bread and wine, blasphemous substitutes were rumoured, black animals, toads, or unholy concoctions. in place of prayers, obscene chants, and presiding not a priest of Christ, but a priest of Satan, cloaked in darkness. To medieval ears, such rumours were terrifying because they struck at the heart of salvation. One of the earliest accounts comes from 14th century France, during the trials of the Knights Templar. Accused of heresy, some Templars confessed under torture to spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, and kissing obscene images. Though historians doubt the accuracy of these charges, the image of inverted ritual took hold. Soon, heretical groups across Europe were accused of gathering at night, renouncing Christ, and celebrating the devil. The Black Mass became a shorthand for the worst possible crime, treason against heaven itself. Quirky details in these accusations are revealing. Some chronicles claim the devil appeared in the form of a black goat, seated on a throne, to receive homage. Others described initiates kissing the goat's rear as a grotesque parody of the Christian cave. Is of peace. In some versions, babies were sacrificed. In others, consecrated hosts stolen from churches were trampled. The sheer extravagance of these tales suggests more about the fears of inquisitors than the practices of any actual sect. Scholars still debate whether black masses were ever truly performed in the Middle Ages, or whether they existed only as an imagined inversion, a projection of Christian anxieties. Yet whether real or imagined, the Black Mass served a powerful function. It explained why evil seemed so persistent, because the devil had his own church, a perverse mirror of Christ's. Just as Christians gathered in daylight to receive grace, witches and heretics were thought to gather in darkness to receive damnation. The devil was not merely a tempter, he was a rival deity with his own liturgy, sacraments, and congregation. The most famous evolution of this fear was the Sabbath, the supposed nocturnal assembly of witches. By the 15th century, stories circulated of flights through the night to lonely fields or mountaintops, where witches feasted, danced, and worshipped the devil. These Sabbaths were said to culminate in the Black Mass, sealing the pact with blasphemy. Descriptions varied wildly. Some spoke of orgies, others of grotesque feasts of poisoned food, but always the essence was inversion. Holy things made unholy, order turned to chaos. One curious anecdote survives from the Alpine witch trials of the 15th century. A woman confessed to attending a Sabbath where demons distributed food that tasted of ash and music played that was sweet at first, but grew unbearable. The detail is haunting because it reflects a recurring theme in diabolic lore. The devil could mimic, but never truly create. His gifts were always hollow, his pleasures sour. The Black Mass, then, was not only terrifying but pitiful, a counterfeit church that could only mock, never equal, the real. The fear of such rites shaped policy and persecution. Inquisitors warned that gatherings of women at night, especially midwives or healers, might be Sabbaths in disguise. Rural festivals once seen as harmless could now be branded as diabolical assemblies. Even social gatherings, singing, dancing, drinking, were cast under suspicion. The devil, it seemed, could be lurking in every circle. Still, doubts persisted. Some theologians argued that the Sabbath was a delusion planted by the devil in dreams, not a physical event. Others insisted the meetings were real and dangerous. Scholars still debate whether confessions of black masses reflect actual clandestine rituals or fantasies shaped by interrogation and cultural imagination. What cannot be denied is that the image of the Black Mass became one of the most potent symbols of satanic power in the late medieval mind. It is telling that the Black Mass, whether real or imagined, centered on parody. To medieval Christians, parody itself was threatening. Laughter could be holy when directed at folly, but mockery of the sacred was unforgivable. The devil's greatest trick, then, was not only to tempt, but to twist, to take what was most holy and turn it upside down. The Black Mass crystallized this fear into a single, nightmarish image, the Church of Satan chanting against the Church of Christ. Thus, in the arc imagination of the Middle Ages, the devil no longer lurked only in solitary temptations or in courtroom ordeals. He was now envisioned as presiding over his own blasphemous liturgies, a counterfeit priest at a counterfeit altar. And though historians still question whether such ceremonies ever took place, their imagined power was enough to fuel centuries of fear, accusation, and persecution. The devil in the village. If the Black Mass belonged to whispered rumours of heretics and witches gathering in remote fields, the everyday devil lived much closer to home. In the medieval village, where most Europeans spent their entire lives, the devil was not a distant figure, but a daily presence woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. He was the shadow behind unexplained accidents, the trickster who spoiled the harvest, the whisperer at the hearth after sundown. For peasants who lived precariously close to famine, disease, and misfortune, it was easy to see Satan's hand in every turn of bad luck. Unlike the solemn devils of theologians, the village devil was often mischievous, even comical. In folk tales told beside the fire, he might be fooled by a clever farmer or humiliated by a quick-witted woman. He might bargain for a soul only to be tricked into receiving a worthless object. One popular motif across Europe was the devil outsmarted by his own greed. A farmer promises him half of his crops, but when harvest comes, the farmer tricks him into taking the useless half, the roots instead of the grain, or the stalks instead of the tubers. In such stories, the devil is dangerous but not invincible, a figure of fear and laughter both. These tales had an important social function. They allowed communities to imagine themselves not only as victims of demonic power, but as survivors who could outwit evil. The devil might lurk in the shadows, but cleverness, resilience, and communal solidarity offered protection. Humour became a form of resistance. By laughing at the devil, villagers symbolically diminished his power. And yet, alongside this trickster devil was a more sinister presence. When storms destroyed crops, when cattle sickened, when infants died suddenly, suspicion often fell upon the devil's work, and by extension on the human neighbours he might be using. Gossip coup. LD quickly turned into accusation. The devil's presence in the village was never neutral. It blurred into the realities of social tension, envy, and rivalry. In communities where survival depended on fragile balance, blaming Satan could easily mask deeper conflicts between families or classes. Archaeological finds shed light on this everyday fear. In England, for example, witch bottles have been unearthed, jugs filled with nails, hair, or pins buried beneath thresholds to ward off evil spirits. In some homes, shoes were hidden in chimneys as protection against the devil. These were not grand theological gestures, but humble attempts to make a household safe from unseen forces. In the quiet of village life, where daylight was short and night stretched long, such protections must have felt urgently necessary. A quirky tidbit comes from 14th century Germany, where villagers believed the devil could be trapped by making him count impossible numbers of grains or knots. Stories tell of peasants scattering seeds across a floor so that any demon entering would be compelled to count them until dawn, by which time his power would fade. This reflects a widespread medieval fascination with tricking spirits through riddles or impossible tasks, turning the devil's cleverness back against him. But beneath the humour was always dread. In folk imagination, the devil was not just a nuisance but a corrupter, always seeking to ensnare souls. A careless oath, a rash bargain, even an idle curse could be twisted into a contract. Scholars still debate whether peasants truly believed these folkloric pacts could bind a soul eternally, or whether the stories served more as cautionary parables. What is clear is that the devil was felt as intimate, present in the barn, the field, and the very soil beneath one's feet. The village devil also mingled with older pre-Christian traditions. In remote valleys or forest communities, pagan spirits of nature were sometimes reinterpreted as demonic. A mischievous sprite that spoiled milk or stole bread might once have been a household god or forest fairy, now recast as one of the devil's minions. The church worked tirelessly to stamp out such beliefs, but in practice, old and new mingled. The devil of the village was a hybrid, part Satan, part trickster spirit, part scapegoat for life's misfortunes. An evocative example comes from a French folk tale. A miller, desperate for help, makes a bargain with the devil to finish grinding his grain, but the devil, bound by the deal, works through the night only to be driven off at dawn by the ringing of church bells. The story reflects a deep cultural rhythm. Night belonged to the devil, but day belonged to God. So long as the bells rang in the morning, the community could breathe again. Yet there was always unease. The same hearth that offered warmth could feel dangerous when shadows flickered against the walls. In a world with no artificial light, night was not simply absence of day, but a realm of otherness, and the devil was its prince. To step outside after dark, especially alone, was to risk an encounter with forces unseen. The villager's devil was therefore not just a theological abstract. I am but an everyday fear, the rustle of trees in the dark, the sudden howl of a dog, the creak of a door. In this way, the devil in the village served as both explanation and warning. He explained why things went wrong, why fate could be cruel, and he warned against folly, greed, or hubris, reminding listeners that evil lurked just beyond the circle of firelight. Through tales told at the hearth, whispered suspicions, and rituals of protection, the devil became part of the very fabric of medieval village life. Not distant, but close, intimate, and always waiting. Hellmouth and stage plays. If the village devil crept in through gossip and folklore, the cathedral devil leapt out in stone and spectacle. For medieval Christians, fear of damnation was not confined to whispered stories. It was carved into the walls of churches, painted in manuscripts, and performed on the stage. Perhaps the most iconic image was the Hellmouth, a gigantic monster's jaw, gaping wide, into which sinners were dragged, shoved, or swallowed whole. It was a theatre of terror as vivid and immediate as the stained glass above the altar. The Hellmouth motif first appeared in Anglo-Saxon art around the 11th century and soon spread across Europe. Imagine walking into a church and seeing a tympanum above the portal, carved with demons prodding naked souls into a dragon-like mouth. To the illiterate majority, such images were sermons in stone. One needed no Latin to understand. This was the price of sin. In illuminated manuscripts, the same vision repeated. Sinners crammed into the devil's maw, their faces frozen in terror, their tormentors gleeful. The power of these images lay not just in fear, but in immediacy. Unlike distant theological debates, the Hellmouth was a picture everyone could grasp. Children and elders alike could see the fate awaiting the damned. In some cases, churchgoers literally entered beneath the carving of hell as they stepped into the nave, walking past a warning of eternal peril. It made the devil's victory visceral, a spectacle both grotesque and unforgettable. This visual theatre was echoed in performance. By the 12th century, mystery plays and miracle plays were common across Europe, often performed in marketplaces or during church festivals. These dramas retold biblical stories and saints' lives, but always the devil stole the show. Dressed in outlandish costumes, with horns, tails, and painted faces, actors playing devils bounded onto the stage with roars and tricks, terrifying and delighting audiences in equal measure. Quirky details abound. Some records tell of devils with inflated pig bladders which they would smack against the crowd for comic effect. Others carried sulphur or fireworks to create smoke and stench, turning their entrances into spectacles of noise and fire. Children screamed, adults laughed nervously, and everyone was reminded of the lurking power of sin. These devils were not merely frightening, they were also the carnival's clowns, mischievous entertainers, who revealed the dangerous allure of evil. Scholars still debate whether the comic devils of medieval theatre undermined or reinforced the Church's warnings. On one hand, the laughter may have blunted fear, turning Satan into a figure of ridicule. On the other, the unforgettable sight of the Hellmouths swallowing souls, or the devil dragging sinners across the stage, etched the reality of damnation into popular memory. Perhaps this duality was part of the design, fear and laughter intertwined, making the devil impossible to ignore. One of the most famous stage devices was the Hellmouth prop itself. In large productions, a painted or sculpted mouth would open at centre stage, belching smoke and flame as sinners were hauled inside. Imagine the spectacle: villagers gathering in a square, the drama unfolding, and suddenly the ground itself seeming to gape open into hell. For audiences with little access to abstract theology, this was salvation and damnation made tangible. Not only plays, but also carvings and frescoes reinforced the theme. In the Cathedral of Autumn, France, a 12th century tympanum by the sculptor Gislebertus shows demons weighing souls, gleefully tipping the scales, while angels struggle to protect the innocent. Elsewhere, grotesque gargoyles jutted from cathedral roofs, half protective, half terrifying, reminders that the devil's gaze extended even into sacred spaces. To walk through a medieval town was to be surrounded by a landscape of warning. A curious anecdote survives from England. During a 15th century performance of The Harrowing of Hell, the actor playing the devil fell into the Hellmouth prop and broke his leg. The audience reportedly took it as a sign of divine justice, a literal humiliation of Satan himself. Such accidents blurred the line between drama and reality, reminding spectators that the devil's presence was never far from the world they inhabited. What fascinates modern historians is how these performances blurred entertainment with moral instruction. Villagers might laugh at the devil's pratfalls, but they would go home remembering his flames. The devil became not just a theological adversary, but a character, loud, flamboyant, and unforgettable. In a sense, he was medieval Europe's first celebrity villain, performed in every marketplace and carved into every church wall. Still, questions linger. Scholars still debate whether these vivid depictions reflected a genuine fear of hell, or whether by ritualizing and dramatizing it, communities found a way to domesticate fear. Was the Hellmouth truly terrifying, or did it provide the thrill of safe fright, like a medieval haunted house? The truth may lie somewhere in between. The devil was both laughed at and dreaded, mocked and feared. By the close of the Middle Ages, the devil was everywhere in public imagination, etched in stone, acted on stage, painted in manuscripts. He was no longer confined to whispered legends of witches or the scholars' disputations. He had become a spectacle, a performer in the theatre of salvation and damnation, his gaping hellmouth swallowing souls in front of all to see, and in that spectacle his power was magnified, not a hidden whisperer, but a roaring presence in art, drama, and daily vision. The Inquisitor's devil. By the 13th century, the devil had become more than a figure of folklore, theatre, or stone. He was woven into the machinery of power, codified in manuals and pursued through courts. Where once devils danced on the margins of manuscripts, they now stalked the parchment of legal decrees. This was the devil of the Inquisitors, a bureaucratized adversary, systematized into evidence, procedure, and punishment. The rise of the Inquisition changed everything. Originally established to root out heresy, particularly the Cathars in southern France, the inquisitorial system quickly found the devil to be a useful weapon. Heretics were not simply erring Christians, they were agents of Satan, consciously or unconsciously serving his cause. By recasting theological dissent as diabolical conspiracy, inquisitors transformed local quarrels into cosmic battles. In this way, the devil became the hidden hand behind every deviation, a force that legitimized the Church's sternest measures. One of the most infamous tools of this era was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer. Though technically a late medieval text, its spirit was shaped by centuries of inquisitorial thought. The book described in painstaking detail how witches supposedly served the devil, made pacts with him, and carried out his schemes. It was part handbook, part manifesto, instructing inquisitors how to detect, interrogate, and prosecute the devil's servants. With chilling confidence, it argued that to doubt the existence of witches was itself heresy, because it denied the devil's reach. This new devil was not the playful trickster of village tales, but a systematic corrupter. He had an organization, an agenda, and followers who could be identified, questioned, and condemned. Inquisitors, armed with official sanction, began to hunt not just heretics, but anyone suspected of witchcraft, sorcery, or diabolic influence. Accusations ranged from flying at night to poisoning wells, from spoiling crops to summoning storms. Every unexplained misfortune could be reframed as Satan's work carried out by human accomplices. Yet the inquisitors did not only rely on fear, they built procedures. Confessions were prized, extracted under threat, persuasion, or, all too often, torture. Once obtained, these testimonies painted elaborate pictures of sabbats, pacts, and demonic encounters. Inquisitorial records are full of descriptions that read like nightmares. Women describing being carried by demons through the night sky, men confessing to signing contracts in blood, communities whispering of shadowy gatherings. Whether these were genuine beliefs, forced confessions, or projections of inquisitors' own imaginations, the effect was the same, a growing archive of evidence that the devil was everywhere. A quirky but telling detail comes from an inquisitorial record in Switzerland, where a woman confessed under questioning that she had ridden to a witches' gathering not on a broom but on a large butter churn. The image seems absurd to us, but for inquisitors it became part of the proof. Even the absurd could be evidence when filtered through the lens of demonic obsession. It reveals how flexible the devil's narrative was. Any oddity could be made to fit. But scholars still debate whether inquisitors truly believed in the vast diabolical conspiracy they described, or whether it was a convenient framework to control communities and consolidate power. Some argue that fear of Satan was genuine, born of theological conviction. Others see the inquisitorial devil as an invention, a useful fiction that transformed local disputes into cosmic battles, justifying extreme measures. The truth, as so often, likely lies somewhere between belief and strategy, feeding one another until even the absurd could become part of official record. The social consequences were devastating. To be accused of serving the devil was to lose one's standing, one's family, often one's life. Entire villages could be consumed by suspicion, neighbours turning against neighbours, every misfortune attributed to demonic plots. The devil, once laughed at in plays, was now deadly serious. He was the justification for imprisonment, interrogation, and execution. At the same time, the inquisitorial devil reshaped popular imagination. The once ambiguous trickster became an organised tyrant, commanding legions of witches and heretics. The line between folklore and theology blurred. Village tales of witches flying to sabbats merged with scholastic theories of demonic pacts. What had once been stories by the fire became evidence in courtrooms. The devil, in this new guise, was no longer just an object of laughter or fear. He was a category of law. And yet, even amid this terrifying machinery, traces of the old humour lingered. Some accused persons, when pressed to describe their dealings with Satan, recounted scenes so bizarre, demons demanding chickens, or the devil unable to count properly, that they almost seem like echoes of the trickster tales. Perhaps these were half-remembered stories reshaped under duress, or perhaps, even in the shadow of torture, people could not help but imagine the devil as both fearsome and ridiculous. The Inquisitor's devil, then, was a paradox, meticulously catalogued, fiercely prosecuted, yet still shaped by the messy contours of human imagination. In bureaucratic hands, Satan became less a figure of wild folklore and more a structure, a way of explaining dissent, channeling fear, and exercising control. From the parchment of trial records to the pyres of condemned witches, he became a tool of power, as real in the courtroom as in the pulpit. The devil's animals. If the devil himself was too vast or too terrifying to appear in daily life, he often came in smaller, more familiar forms. Animals. In the medieval imagination, creatures could carry Satan's presence, either as his messengers, his disguises, or his companions. When villagers looked around their farms, forests and barns, they sometimes saw not harmless beasts, but paw prints of the infernal. Cats were perhaps the most infamous of these. In particular, the black cat became a potent symbol of witchcraft and demonic presence. By the 13th century, clerical writers were already warning of cats as creatures beloved of witches, sometimes even as incarnations of the devil himself. Inquisitorial manuals repeated the charge that witches' cats served as familiars, little demon helpers who whispered secrets, spoiled milk, or carried curses. It is no coincidence that cats, creatures of the night with reflective eyes and stealthy movements, seemed alien in their independence. For peasants used to animals that served practical purposes, cows for milk, dogs for guarding, horses for work, the aloof and unpredictable cat could feel uncanny, even threatening. But cats were not alone. Frogs and toads, dwelling in damp, liminal spaces, were often associated with sorcery and poison. The toad especially appeared in trial records as a creature kissed or fed by witches in their rituals. In French folklore, some believed that the devil sometimes appeared in the form of a monstrous toad, its body bloated, its eyes glowing. Snakes, long connected to the serpent of Eden, carried obvious associations with temptation and deceit. Owls too drew suspicion, nocturnal hunters whose eerie cries seemed to echo in the dark. A striking example comes from the witch trials of Basel in the 15th century, where testimony described witches keeping toads in little boxes, feeding them bits of bait, red and drops of their own blood. The toads, in turn, were said to help them summon storms or bring illness. Whether these accounts were inventions of inquisitors or echoes of older folk practices, the idea of animal companions serving as diabolic assistants took firm hold in popular imagination. Dogs, normally seen as loyal guardians, could also be suspect if they appeared strange or unaccountable. A black dog wandering through a village might be taken as an omen of Satan's presence. In English folklore, the black shuck, a ghostly hound with burning eyes, was said to prowl the countryside, its appearance a harbinger of death. The idea that the devil might come in canine form appears even in court records. Accused witches sometimes confessed, under pressure, that their master appeared to them as a great black dog. Scholars still debate whether belief in demonic animals grew primarily from official teaching or from grassroots superstition. On one hand, inquisitorial records often read like extensions of folklore, suggesting that villagers themselves feared uncanny creatures long before the church codified those fears. On the other hand, the emphasis on animals as evidence of diabolic activity may have been amplified by inquisitors eager to find tangible signs of witchcraft. What is certain is that the devil's beasts became part of a shared language of suspicion, bridging elite theology and village storytelling. There were also quirky exceptions. In some regions, not cats or toads but hares were thought to be witches' companions. Stories circulated of witches transforming into hares to escape pursuit, a belief that persisted well into the early modern period. In one tale from Germany, a farmer struck a hare with a stick, only to find later that a village woman appeared with the same wound. These metamorphosis legends blurred the line between animal familiar and human way. itch, making animals an extension of the devil's disguise. Art reinforced these associations. In manuscript margins, one finds frogs, cats, and monkeys cavorting with devils, each carrying symbolic weight. Cathedral carvings sometimes show grotesque beasts gnawing on sinners or crouching at the edges of Hellmouths, embodying the fusion of the animal and the demonic. For a medieval audience, the natural world was alive with spiritual resonance, every creature a potential messenger of good or evil. It is important to remember, too, that not all cultures treated these animals the same way. In parts of the Islamic world, cats were regarded positively, often linked to purity. The stark demonization of cats in medieval Europe, culminating in persecutions during witch hunts, seems unique to the Christian West. Scholars sometimes wonder whether the fear of animals as diabolic familiars reflected deeper anxieties about the uncontrollable forces of nature, disease, storms, failed harvests, that people sought to personify in tangible, everyday creatures. One curious anecdote reveals how pervasive the suspicion became. During the 14th century, Pope Gregory IX reportedly issued a papal bull condemning the veneration of cats, linking them to devil worship. While historians debate the authenticity and extent of this decree, its survival in chronicles suggests how seriously the Church could treat even the smallest creatures as part of Satan's arsenal. And yet, alongside the terror, there was fascination. Tales of witches' animals gave storytellers vivid imagery, while also providing communities with explanations for misfortune. A thick cow, perhaps the witch's toad had cursed it. A barn fire, perhaps the devil in cat form had stalked too near. In this way, animals became intermediaries between the human and the infernal, their strange habits reframed as evidence of Satan's reach. Thus, in barns and hearths, forests and fields, the devil prowled and not only in grand visions of Hellmouths, but also in the flick of a cat's tail, the croak of a toad, the howl of a hound. To live in the Middle Ages was to share one's world with beasts that were never simply themselves. They might be spies of the devil, lurking in plain sight. The scholarly devil. While peasants whispered of cats and toads, while inquisitors hunted for witches in villages, another world of the devil took shape in cloisters and lecture halls. Universities, newly flourishing in the 12th and 13th centuries, became arenas where theology met philosophy, and where scholars attempted to pin down the nature of Satan with the same precision they applied to Aristotle or Augustine. Here, the devil was less a shadow in the woods and more a question on parchment. What is the nature of evil? What powers do demons truly hold? Can the devil act independently, or is he always bound by God's will? At Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, masters debated these questions in disputations that could stretch for days. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential scholastic thinker, devoted portions of his Summa Theologica to demons. He argued that the devil was a fallen angel, possessing immense knowledge but limited by God's sovereignty. Demons, in his view, could not read human thoughts directly, but they could infer them through observation. They could not create life, but they could manipulate the natural world, moving objects, stirring the winds, igniting passions in the human heart. To Aquinas, the devil was not omnipotent, but dangerous precisely because of his cunning and his ability to exploit human weakness. Other thinkers went further. Peter Lombard, in his Sentences, compiled earlier teachings on the devil and forced students to wrestle with contradictions. Could demons repent, or were they eternally fixed in malice? Was their suffering in hell equal to their crimes? Such questions were not idle. They shaped sermons, guided confessors, and filtered down into the imaginations of ordinary believers. When a preacher thundered about Satan in a village church, he often echoed arguments refined in a university disputation hall. A quirky detail illustrates the scholastic fascination. Albertus Magnus, teacher of Aquinas, is sometimes said in later legends to have dabbled in necromancy or conjuring, though these tales are almost certainly apocryphal. Yet, the very fact such rumours attach themselves to a scholar underscores how blurred the line could be between studying demons and consorting with them. Intellectual curiosity about the devil could itself look suspicious, yet scholars still debate whether scholastic discussions of the devil were meant to demystify him or to reinforce his terror. On one hand, by subjecting Satan to logical analysis, theologians stripped away some of the superstition, framing him as a rationally comprehensible being. On the other, these same treatises confirmed the devil's reality and gave intellectual scaffolding to fears that otherwise might have faded. In this sense, the universities did for Satan what inquisitors did for witchcraft. They formalized him, gave him rules and parameters, and made him part of the official architecture of Christian thought. Philosophical debates about the devil also intersected with questions of free will. If humans sinned, was it always by their own choice, or could the devil compel them? Augustine had earlier argued that evil comes from the will's misuse, not from external compulsion. Scholastics generally upheld this, insisting that Satan could tempt but never force. Yet the persistence of temptation, why some fell while others resisted, remained a puzzle. For some, the devil became a metaphor for the darker recesses of human psychology, long before modern terms existed. The devil also featured in discussions of natural philosophy. Could demons cause storms? Many scholastics answered yes, but only by manipulating natural forces already present, never by creating from nothing. Could they heal the sick or kill the healthy? Again, yes, but only by influencing humours or corrupting matter, not by overstepping God's laws. The devil, paradoxically, was imagined as both immensely powerful and tightly circumscribed. He was, in scholastic thought, the ultimate lawyer, exploiting loopholes in creation's order, never outright overturning it. A favourite scholastic puzzle concerned the devil's knowledge. If demons were fallen angels, did they retain their angelic intellect? Did they know the future? Aquinas maintained that they did not know it perfectly, but could predict it more shrewdly than humans, much like a master chess player anticipating many moves ahead. This made them formidable adversaries, not because they knew everything, but because they knew enough to exploit ignorance. The scholarly devil, then, was a figure of paradox, constrained yet cunning, defeated yet dangerous. He was less a grotesque monster and more an intellectual adversary, a challenge to logic as much as to morality. In lecture halls where students scratched notes with quills, Satan became a subject of argument, citation, and careful classification. This scholastic framework trickled down into sermons, art, and popular belief. The peasant who feared a black cat and the theologian who debated demonic epistemology were, in their own ways, participating in the same vast conversation about evil. In one world, the devil scratched at barn doors. In another, he occupied the margins of glossed manuscripts, and always his presence demanded explanation. Thus, in the Middle Ages, the devil lived not only in whispers and bonfires, but also in the airy halls of universities, where scholars armed with Aristotle and Augustine sought to map the contours of hell itself. Devil at the crossroads. If the universities gave the devil his logic, the villages gave him his stage. In taverns, crossroads, and lonely clearings, stories circulated of men and women who bargained directly with Satan. These were not abstract disputations, but vivid flesh and blood encounters. Midnight meetings where a traveller might trade his soul for wealth, love, or skill. The motif of the devil at the crossroads captured the imagination of medieval Europe, weaving together folk belief, moral warning, and the tantalizing idea of forbidden power. Crossroads themselves were places of mystery. In pre-Christian tradition, they were liminal spaces where worlds overlapped, roads met, boundaries blurred, and spirits lingered. Execution sites were often placed there, suicides buried in the margins of the Christian community. It was little wonder that such locations became natural settings for tales of the infernal. If one sought to summon the devil, the crossroads was where the barrier between worlds might be thinnest. Accounts from medieval chronicles, though rarer than later legends, hint at this association. In 14th century Germany, tales told of necromancers who drew circles in dirt at crossroads, chanting invocations until a black figure appeared. In some French folklore, the devil was said to offer gifts to desperate peasants, perhaps a bag of coins, perhaps the promise of vengeance against an enemy, in exchange for oaths of loyalty. These exchanges, whether real or imagined, gave form to the haunting idea that salvation could be traded away like property. The structure of the pact itself fascinated both storytellers and theologians. Could a man truly sell his soul? Scholastic writers like Aquinas insisted that the soul belonged to God alone and could not be alienated. Yet inquisitors recorded confessions where witches claimed to have signed contracts in blood. One quirky detail from a 15th century trial described a woman who allegedly signed not with ink but by pressing her fingernail into the devil's parchment until blood welled forth. Whether this was invention, coercion, or folklore entering the courtroom, it illustrates the medieval sense of contracts as literal, binding, and terrifying. Music, too, was touched by these legends. Long before the modern myth of a bluesman trading his soul for skill, medieval Europe already whispered of musicians who had made bargains for talent. The so-called diabolus in musica, the forbidden tritone interval, was rumoured in some circles to summon uneasy forces. While church authorities never claimed that a single note could conjure the devil, the association of music, temptation, and dark inspiration took deep root. Scholars still debate whether medieval listeners truly linked the tritone with Satan or whether this is a later exaggeration. But the aura of danger around certain sounds paralleled the aura of danger around the crossroads themselves. These bargains were not always grandiose. Some folklore tells of men who asked the devil for beer that never ran dry, for dice that always rolled in their favour, or for charms that made them irresistible to women. Such earthy desires say as much about the hopes of the poor as they do about theological fears. The devil, in these tales, was not a cosmic adversary, but a trickster merchant, dealing in simple pleasures while claiming infinite stakes. Yet the devil's promises were rarely fulfilled as expected. Coins turned to leaves, beer to vinegar, lovers to corpses. Like the fairies of Celtic lore, the devil was a deceiver who left his clients ruined. The moral was clear: no bargain with evil could prosper. And yet, the allure of the possibility, the chance to leapfrog fate itself, was powerful enough to keep the stories alive. One curious survival of this idea lies in the legend of Theophilus of Adana, a 6th century cleric said to have sold his soul to the devil for advancement in the church. His tale, widely retold in medieval plays and sermons, ended with him repenting and being saved by the Virgin Mary, but it crystallized the archetype of the soul-selling pact. By the later Middle Ages, Theophilus became a template for countless other tales, ambition leading to diabolic contracts, and salvation only through desperate repentance. The crossroads motif also reflected social anxieties. It was at the edge of communities, where law and custom grew thin, that people feared temptation most. Here, travellers could meet strangers without identity. Here, oaths could be sworn unseen. Here, temptation whispered. By placing the devil at the crossroads, storytellers externalized a deeper truth. Temptation often comes at moments of choice, when paths diverge and decisions must be made. Scholars today note that the motif survived well beyond the medieval period. From German Faust legends, of the 16th century to modern blues folklore, the idea of trading one's soul for power has proven one of the most enduring of all diabolic themes. Yet in the medieval context, it carried particular urgency. In a world of scarce resources and strict hierarchies, the thought that one could bypass fate with a signature of blood was at once horrifying and strangely hopeful. So in village gossip and scholastic argument, in plays, poems, and whispered warnings, the devil at the crossroads stood as both a story and a symbol. He embodied the danger of easy solutions, the peril of ambition, and the mystery of choice. And at night, when travellers hurried past the meeting of roads, perhaps they cast a nervous glance into the shadows, half wondering whether a figure waited there ready to bargain. The devil in music. If the devil haunted crossroads, where men struck bargains, he also haunted melodies drifting through cloisters, taverns, and cathedrals. Music in the Middle Ages was never just entertainment. It was a vessel of order, harmony, and theology. To sing was to echo the angels, to chant was to participate in the liturgy of heaven. But where there was music of God, there could also be music of the devil. The medieval imagination cast sound itself as a battleground, a place where the celestial choir and the infernal chorus struggled for human souls. In monasteries, the discipline of Gregorian chant was seen as a direct reflection of divine order. Its strict intervals, measured tones, and solemn beauty were meant to banish chaos. Augustine of Hippo had written centuries earlier that music's order could lift the mind to God, yet even Augustine admitted he feared music's power. What if one loved the sound more than the sacred words? That same unease carried into the Middle Ages, where the devil was believed to twist music into seduction, distracting worshippers and luring them toward vice. One notorious detail from music history is the so-called diabolus in musica, the devil in music. This term, attached in later centuries to the tritone interval, gained its diabolic reputation during the medieval period. The dissonant sound jarred against the ordered harmonies of chant, creating unease in the listener. Guido of Arezzo, an 11th century theorist, advised against its use, and by the 13th century it was often called the devil's interval. Did church authorities truly forbid it? Scholars still debate whether this was a literal ban or a metaphorical warning. What is clear is that the association of discordant sound with the devil resonated deeply in a culture that prized harmony as a reflection of divine perfection. But the devil's presence in music was not confined to theory. Folklore told of wandering minstrels who learned songs from infernal teachers, or of fiddlers whose fingers moved too fast to be natural. In Ireland and Brittany, legends described fairy musicians whose uncanny tunes left listeners entranced for days. Sometimes these beings were said to be fairies, sometimes demons in disguise, but always they suggested that music could be a dangerous gift. The courtly love songs of troubadours added another layer. Their lyrics celebrated desire, often straining against the boundaries of Christian morality. To some preachers, the sensual melodies of these poets smacked of diabolic inspiration. A 12th century sermon thundered that such music opens the gate to the devil in the soul. Whether or not the devil had truly composed a troubadour's ballad, the fear reveals how precarious the line between beauty and temptation could be. There is even a curious fringe tale whispered in late medieval lore of Pope Sylvester II, a scholar pope accused of sorcery, who was said to have built a mechanical organ with infernal aid. The organ allegedly played by itself, summoning eerie harmonies that astonished listeners. Almost certainly a legend, it nonetheless illustrates how unusual musical innovation could be recast as a diabolic trick. To exceed what was expected in sound was to risk suspicion. Yet music could also be used against the devil. Exorcism rituals often employed chants, psalms, or bells, whose vibrations were thought to drive demons away. The tolling of a church bell was not only a call to prayer, but a sonic weapon against spirits lurking in the fields. In some villages, children sang sacred hymns while walking the boundaries of farmland, invoking harmony as a shield against infernal chaos. Music, in this sense, was both temptation and defense, both the devil's lure and his undoing. The medieval imagination extended the devil's relationship with music into the afterlife. In mystery plays performed outside cathedrals, hell was often depicted as a place not only of fire, but of grotesque sound, shrieking demons, clanging pots, distorted instruments. The discord contrasted with the ordered harmony of heaven, reinforcing the theological idea that sin was dissonance, salvation harmony. And yet, despite sermons and suspicion, music remained irresistible. Pilgrims sang on roads, peasants danced in fields, kings sponsored musicians in their halls. The devil's alleged grip on music did not silence it. It made it richer, more charged with meaning. The possibility that a tune might be tainted only heightened its allure. Like the Crossroads Pact, the diabolic in music revealed a truth about human nature. Forbidden sounds, like forbidden knowledge, often captivated the most. Scholars today still puzzle over the cultural weight of the diabolus in musica. Was it truly a sound medieval ears linked to Satan, or has its association been exaggerated in hindsight? What is certain is that medieval culture viewed dissonance as perilous, harmony as holy. To invoke disorder was to brush against the infernal, and in that sense, every strange chord or wandering melody became a potential site of encounter with the devil. Thus, the medieval devil lived not only in fire, parchment, or pact, but in the very air. He was carried on the vibrations of a lute string, hidden in the pauses between chants, and lurking in the half-step that turned sweetness into unease. When monks sang in candlelit choirs and peasants danced beneath harvest moons, the question remained: was this music lifting souls to heaven, or was it perhaps the devil's tune? Politics of the devil. If the devil crept through chants and crossroads, he also stood on battlefields, in royal courts, and in the rhetoric of power. Medieval politics was never free of religion. Every king's legitimacy, every rebellion, every crusade was framed as a cosmic struggle, and where heaven and God could be invoked to sanctify authority, the devil was ready to be invoked as the adversary. To brand an enemy as diabolic was to strip them of legitimacy, to paint opposition not as human dissent, but as treachery against the divine order itself. Take the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries, where popes and emperors fought bitterly over who held the right to appoint bishops. In letters exchanged between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, one can sense how accusations of diabolic influence slipped into political discourse. Gregory thundered that Henry was seduced by the devil, while Henry accused the Pope of being the true Antichrist. These were not casual insults. In a world where the devil was seen as an active force, such charges turned political disputes into apocalyptic battles. The Crusades carried this rhetoric to extremes. Muslim leaders were often depicted in Latin chronicles as servants of Satan, their armies described as the devil's host. Yet, in Islamic sources too, Christian crusaders were occasionally portrayed as demonic invaders. The devil became a universal shorthand for dehumanizing enemies, reducing the complexities of war to stark moral binaries. The battlefield itself was imagined as a theatre of cosmic struggle, where banners of Christ clashed against banners of hell. Closer to home, rulers used the devil to undermine rivals. In England, after the death of William Rufus in 1100, chroniclers noted that many believed his irreligious behaviour had marked him as the devil's man. In France, Philip IV's destruction of the Knights Templar in 1307 hinged on accusations that the order secretly worshipped demons. The charges were likely fabricated to seize wealth and neutralize a powerful institution, but the diabolic branding worked. Public opinion turned against the Templars, paving the way for their downfall. Even peasants, when rebelling, found themselves caught in this web of demonization. The German Peasants' War of the 1520s, though later than the High Medieval period, followed a long tradition where rebels were accused of being incited by the devil. Chroniclers described insurgent leaders as diabolical deceivers, suggesting that rebellion was not a product of hunger or injustice, but of infernal corruption. In this way, the devil served as a tool for elites to deny the legitimacy of popular resistance. One curious fringe example comes from the legend of Robert the Devil, a medieval romance tale in which a Norman nobleman was said to have been fathered by Satan himself. Though fictional, the story blurred into historical gossip, with some claiming it cast a shadow over the lineage of William the Conqueror. Whether believed or not, the tale reveals how even dynastic legitimacy could be coloured with whispers of infernal ancestry. And then there was Joan of Arc. In the 15th century, her visions inspired French armies to rally against the English. To her supporters, she was guided by God and saints. To her enemies, she was inspired by demons. At her trial in Rouen, English-backed clerics insisted that her voices came not from heaven but from the devil. This accusation was central to justifying her execution. Burn her not as a military opponent but as a witch, an agent of hell. Only decades later was she exonerated, her diabolic branding revealed as a political weapon. The devil in politics thus became a mirror. Whoever opposed you was painted as his servant. In this way, theology reinforced hierarchy, discouraging dissent and sanctifying rulers' authority. If you resisted taxation, if you questioned a bishop, if you sided with the wrong claimant to the throne, you might not merely be called a traitor, you might be condemned as diabolical. Scholars still debate whether medieval people truly believed such accusations, or whether they were largely cynical manipulations by the powerful. Some argue that rulers exploited the devil rhetorically, knowing that the populace would respond with fear. Others suggest that even the elites themselves believed that their worldview left no space for mere politics, separate from cosmic struggle. What is certain is that invoking the devil was effective. It silenced debate, justified cruelty, and transformed politics into theatre of salvation and damnation. The devil, then, was not only in the margins of manuscripts or the chants of monasteries, he was a figurehead of propaganda. He marched in armies, he whispered in courts, he signed charters with invisible ink. And in this role, he revealed something timeless, that demonizing one's enemy, literally or metaphorically, is among the oldest and most enduring tools of power. Decline of the medieval devil. By the late Middle Ages, the devil who once loomed so large over Europe began, in curious ways, to diminish. Not vanish entirely, never vanish, but change, soften, and scatter into new shapes. The era that had painted him in monstrous murals, staged him in morality plays, and feared his whispers in courtrooms and cloisters, was also the era that prepared the ground for his decline. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern, the devil's grip loosened, and the causes were as varied as printing presses, humanist thought, and shifting theology. One turning point came with the 15th century expansion of literacy and book culture. Before printing, images of the devil on cathedral portals or in illuminated manuscripts were controlled largely by clergy and elite patrons. With Gutenberg's press in the mid-15th century, ideas spread faster, wider, and beyond clerical gatekeeping. Pamphlets circulated with grotesque caricatures of Satan, but also with satire. The devil became less a terror and more a subject of ridicule. To laugh at him was to rob him of power. Humanism too played a role. Thinkers like Erasmus of Rotterdam challenged the obsession with demons and exorcisms, mocking those who blamed every misfortune on Satan. "The devil," he quipped in one text, "is not so black as he is painted." In his satire, The Praise of Folly, 1511, he suggested that ignorance and folly, not the devil, were the true causes of human vice. Though Erasmus remained a faithful Christian, his intellectual movement shifted the focus from cosmic battles to human agency. Even within theology, the devil's role grew more constrained. Scholastic debates at universities in Paris and Oxford had already wrestled with how much power demons could exert over human will. By the 15th century, theologians increasingly emphasized divine providence and human responsibility. Satan remained an adversary, but he was no longer imagined as omnipresent in every field, every illness, every overturned cart. Meanwhile, popular culture reframed him. In German and English folk tales, the devil became a comic figure, outwitted by peasants, tricked by cunning millers, humiliated by clever maidens. The trickster devil replaced the all-powerful adversary. These stories circulated orally in villages and later in chapbooks, giving rural audiences a devil they could laugh at, a figure not to dread but to mock. One quirky detail comes from the Fastnachtspiele, carnival plays in late medieval Germany, where actors dressed as bumbling devils were jeered by crowds. Instead of commanding terror, these stage demons stumbled, fumbled, and fled in embarrassment. The medieval audience, once cowed by Hellmouth depictions, now delighted in booing Satan off stage. But this was not a simple story of decline. In some quarters, fear of the devil intensified, particularly in the witch hunts of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, the infamous witch-hunting manual, insisted that witches made explicit pacts with the devil and worked his will. For many accused, Satan was more real than ever. Thus, the devil's decline was uneven. In intellectual and artistic spaces, he was mocked. In legal and judicial contexts, he remained deadly. Scholars still debate whether this paradox shows a fragmentation of belief or a deepening of fear that coexisted with mockery. The visual arts mirrored this shift. Early medieval sculpture showed Satan as terrifying beast, swallowing souls into Hellmouth. By the 15th century, painters like Hieronymus Bosch offered surreal, even bizarre depictions. Grotesque demons with fish heads, bird legs, or musical instruments embedded in their bodies. Bosch's work, like the Garden of Earthly Delights, unsettled viewers, but it also invited curiosity, even fascination. The devil's image was becoming more dreamlike, less doctrinal, more imaginative than terrifying. Printing presses helped spread these images widely, sometimes stripped of their moralizing context. A woodcut of a devil might be pinned to a tavern wall, prompting laughter rather than piety. The authority of the pulpit was no longer absolute. Images and words could circulate independently, reshaping the devil's meaning as they travelled. By the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation further complicated his place. Martin Luther spoke vividly of wrestling with the devil, even hurling an inkwell at him in one famous anecdote. Yet Protestants often mocked Catholic rituals as devilish superstition, effectively transferring satanic branding from demons themselves to institutional rivals. Once again, the devil was less a cosmic terror and more a political and cultural weapon. The great irony of the devil's decline in the late Middle Ages is that he became more human. Rather than a beast with horns and claws, he increasingly appeared as a shadowy tempter, a whisperer in the ear, or even a figure indistinguishable from ordinary people. The monstrous had shrunk, the subtle remained. Scholars still debate whether this transition was liberation or disguise. Did humanism and satire truly banish the devil, or did they merely transform him into new forms that persisted quietly? What we can see is that by the dawn of the Renaissance, the medieval Devi, El's reign of terror was waning. He still lurked, still frightened, but no longer held the same monopoly on explanation, imagination, or fear. Thus, the medieval world that once imagined him lurking at every corner began to see him as a clown, a bureaucrat's tool, or a metaphor. The devil had not left Europe, he had simply changed costumes, waiting for the next stage on which to appear, echoes in our imagination. Even after the printing presses clattered, after humanists scoffed and painters distorted, the devil of the Middle Ages never truly disappeared. Instead, he lingered, transformed, refracted, softened into folklore, sharpened into theology, repurposed into art. And though centuries separate us from medieval Europe, the shadows he cast are still with us. When we imagine the devil with horns, hooves, and a forked tail, we are looking at the ghost of a medieval imagination. Those images were sculpted on cathedral tympanums, painted into manuscripts, and carried into theatre, where hellmouths roared open and demons dragged sinners away. Even in cartoons today, devils perched on shoulders, whispering bad ideas, we see the distant afterlife of those medieval plays, where peasants once jeered at bumbling demons. Medieval fears live on, too, in how we speak of politics, of morality, of temptation. Leaders still call rivals demonic, using language medieval popes and kings would recognise. Popular culture still thrills to stories of pacts at crossroads, of witches and black masses, of music said to summon dark powers. We binge-watch television shows where demons stride across screens, and we whisper urban legends that mirror peasant tales told centuries ago. One quirky survivor is the superstition around black cats. In medieval Europe, they were branded diabolical companions, familiars of witches. Even now, some cultures see them as unlucky, while others invert the superstition and treat them as lucky charms. The medieval devil lingers every time a cat slinks across a path and someone hesitates, just for a second. Scholars still debate whether our fascination with the devil today is inherited fear or reinvented myth. Are we truly haunted by medieval terrors, or do we borrow their imagery as symbols for anxieties that are far more modern? Technology, politics, the unknown future. What seems clear is that the devil functions much as he did then, as a mirror for our darkest concerns, shaped not only by belief, but by imagination. And if we lean closer, we notice that the medieval devil was never only about hellfire, he was about control, about the stories we tell to explain chaos, about the forces we blame when fortune fails, about the enemies we demonize to strengthen our own cause. In this sense, the devil has always been ours, reflecting back to us the fears and fantasies we carry. He survives not as a relic, but as an echo. Each Halloween costume with a plastic pitchfork, each heavy metal album invoking infernal imagery, each political headline branding opponents as satanic. These are faint ripples of a medieval worldview where the devil was everywhere, at the feast, in the courtroom, on the stage, at the village crossroads. And perhaps that is why his shadow endures, because the devil of the Middle Ages was never just about theology. He was about imagination, about how people saw the world, and about how we still do. Conclusion. The devil of the Middle Ages was no mere character in a book, no distant abstraction confined to theology. He was visceral, omnipresent, and endlessly adaptable. He strutted across cathedral stages, whispered in monks' ears, haunted the fears of peasants, and sat as a silent advisor in the courts of kings. He was grotesque and comic, terrifying and ridiculous, a figure who both disciplined society and delighted imagination. Today, though centuries separate us, we remain heirs to that medieval devil. We laugh at his caricatures, invoke him as metaphor, and sometimes still fear the shadows he left behind. He reminds us that every age crafts its own adversary, cloaking uncertainty and power struggles in mythic form. In the end, the devil of the Middle Ages is less about hell than about humanity, our hopes, our fears, our need to explain darkness. And in that sense, his story never truly ends,